right. Thank you for joining in today at the Mountaineer Farm Talk. We are glad to have Dr. Ray Smith back today. He is going to be talking a little bit about, how to make good hay. When to cut it, where to cut it, how to cut it, and everything else that goes into that process. We have some loyal listeners out there, and we're glad to have you here. But for the new ones, we try to cover different topics from cattle, hay production, gardening, fruit trees, even a little bit on the insect side. So there's a broad range of topics out there, and we're glad to have all you guys with us. Today, I already said, Dr. Ray Smith is here. He started out born and raised in Georgia. Then he done some little time in Canada there, Virginia Tech, and ended up there in Kentucky as the forage specialist for the last 16 years. So he has a lot of research, and he is very well-rounded. Glad to have you with us.
Good to be with you guys today.
And I have some co-workers here with me today, co-host here. Ben, I'll let you start off there.
Ben Goff, I'm the ag agent for Mason and Putnam counties, and used to work with Ray at the University of Kentucky.
Brandy?
Good morning. I'm Brandy Brabham. I work as the Agriculture and Natural Resources Extension Agent over here in Roane County, and I hope that our producers get a lot of good tips and information from Ray's discussion with us today.
Thank y'all both for being on here with us and joining in with the questions. They always bring great questions to the table. I'll kind of just start it off with a general question. I always like to start from the ground up. I always say we start at the basement and work our way on up the building. Let's start a little bit of the discussion here about soil nutrients. Why is soil nutrients important to that hay crop? And what should we be looking at and doing to make sure we keep that soil nutrients levels where they need to be?
Yeah, really good question, John David. Simply put, the crop to grow needs those nutrients. And usually where I start off is I pull out this forage crop pocket guide. Some of you producers may have that. If not, get your county agents to order some. And there's a section in here that talks about the amount of nutrients that are taken off in a hay crop. And it shows here that a tall fescue hay crop, or predominantly tall fescue, if you remove 3.5 tons during the year, then you're removing 130 pounds of nitrogen, 42 pounds of phosphate, 189 pounds of potash, and other nutrients as well. So when thinking about how much fertilizer to give a hay crop, you need to at least be putting on what you're taking off. So I just wanted to encourage everyone to keep that in mind, and particularly the fact that you're taking off at least 3 times as much potash as phosphate. So if you've been applying triple 19 for a bunch of years, you're probably applying more phosphate than needed and definitely less potash than needed. Now, even better is to go ahead and take a soil test, and then it's going to tell you exactly what nutrients are needed. But if you don't get around to a soil test, or you haven't in a couple of years and you're wondering what to do, just kind of that rule of thumb, 130 nitrogen, 42 phosphate, 189 potash is what that typical grass hay crop is taken off. You can fix that with the nitrogen by adding legumes. And a lot of people want to have a clover grass mixture, but there's no way that you can take care of the phosphate and potash unless you're putting on manure or putting on fertilizer. And then even putting on manure, you end up putting on roughly equal amounts of the phosphate and potash. So you need to be adding more potash fertilizer, more potassium fertilizer. Liming's important too. I don't want to forget that. So you'll get that in your soil test. That'll tell you how much to lime. And not only lime helps those plants grow, helps the legumes to fix nitrogen, but helps make the fertilizer more available as well.
So what levels of pH are we looking at? And, this is a great time to talk a little bit about this, because the Western District Conservation District right now is doing signups, and they have a great lime program out there. And you can sign up to get so much lime reimbursed up to $21 a ton. So what pH should be shooting for, and what happens when that pH creeps down to those plants?
Mhm. So let me start by saying our producers in Kentucky, and I think a lot in West Virginia, would like to have a mixture of clover, red clover, white clover, grass. And when you're adding clover, then you want to be getting the pHs up into the mid sixes. So we say with white clover, above 6.2, red clover, you like to get it up to 6.5. So that's a good goal anyway. Now, grass will grow. You got tall fescue. It's going to grow at a pH of 6. It's going to grow at pH even of 5.5. I mean, as far as surviving, but you're going to be losing your legumes. And any legumes that there are going to fix nitrogen as well. And like I mentioned before, your other nutrients just aren't going to be as available when you get down to those lower pHs. So I guess, John David, the bottom line is you want it to be 6 or better. And if you're going to try to keep legumes in there, then you want to be shooting for 6.5. Someone asked me in a meeting just 2 days ago, can I get the pH too high? And in all my years in Kentucky and in Virginia, I think I only know of 2 cases where people got the pH too high, and they mistakenly put on 5 tons rather than 1 ton. So rarely is it an issue that your pH is going to get too high. So
Good deal. Good deal. And yeah, that's a great thing with the line program we have, that it helps. Historically we have lower pHs in our county, and you can really tell the farmers that participate in those programs, because you can drive by and see the difference. Ben, you had a question there?
Yeah, Ray, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the effects of nitrogen fertilizer on pH, because around here, more people have more recently applied triple 19 state fertilizer always do, because that's what they go with. But rarely did they do lime. Adding a lot of that nitrogen fertilizer actually lowers that pH. I wonder if you can kind of give pointers and tips about that.
Really good point, Ben. And I won't try to go into the chemistry, but if you're applying straight nitrogen or nitrogen in a mixture, then obviously that helps plant growth, but it is lowering the pH. And every year you're going to be lowering the pH by 1 or 2 tenths. So you say, oh, it was great when I soil tested 5 years ago, but it's been dropping, and it may have gone down from 6.5 to 5.5. And so that's just a cost of applying nitrogen. I mean, nitrogen gives us extra growth, but makes it all the more important to keep the keep liming. Now, I mean, even just rainfall is going to drop pH. So again, you could say, well, I haven't been applying nitrogen, I've got clover. But just the way it is in the eastern U.S., the amount of rain that we have, that's gradually over time acidifying the soil. Even if you've got your bedrock is limestone, the amount of rainfall we get makes the soil above the limestone still causes the pH to drop.
What we get this nitrogen, we put it on, we get fertilizer, we get the lime, we get the grass growing like we kind of expect or hope it will grow. We get the rainfall. What stages are we looking at, or heights, or I know we kind of, as extension agents, look at the stage of the grass when we try to cut it. Some people look at the height. Now, where would you kind of come in to tell these producers when to cut?
So the goal that I always shoot for and tell people to shoot for is, if you can cut that first cutting when the cool season grasses are putting up a seed head, if you can cut at the boot stage, which means the seed head hasn't quite come out yet. So the stem's elongated, it's kind of swollen at the top, or right when the seed head's just starting to come out. You've got a good yield there, and you've also got good quality. You might say a good compromise between yield and quality. Now, you at that stage, it could be that it's going to be raining for the next week. There's no point in cutting hay and leaving it to get rained on for a week. So you're going to have to wait till later. But if you can shoot for that stage, then that can make a tremendous difference in having good yield and good quality. I have a number of producers that tell me, well, I like to get it really tall and big seed head, and it gives me more bales, and it lasts longer. Meaning when they're feeding it in the winter, cows don't eat as much. Now, that's because they can't eat as much. It's so fibrous, they're not gaining as much weight. So, I mean, if your only goal is for it to last a long time, I guess you could put straw out there or something, or broom straw. But so, the goal is getting quality and getting some yield. Now, as you move into the summer, and the seed heads are only going to come up in the late spring, unless there's some warm season grasses out there. Then you're cutting more at partly a convenient stage for you, and partly enough growth you think you'll make a good hay crop. So most producers in the states around where we're talking about, West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, 5 to 6 weeks between cuttings after you do that first cutting. If you're talking about a grass or grass clover mixture, you get into something like alfalfa, then it'd be more like a 30 days between cuttings. That makes sense, John David?
Yes, definitely. I think you hit it right on the nail head there. What about we do a lot of dry hay in West Virginia, because we're feeding beef cattle. We're not feeding the dairy side. And if the listeners know me, I'm a big component of dry hay versus the wrapped hay just because of the economics. But we've seen more increases in wrapped hay just because of the weather conditions and patterns we've had over the last 7 years. So let's touch on that, since we do have a lot of producers making that wrapped hay. Is there a difference in cutting? And I know there's definitely a difference in when you bale on that, time-wise.
So, good question. And the real advantage with wrapped hay or baleage is you can cut at that right stage, at that boot stage, and capture the quality, because typically you're letting it wilt overnight before you bale it and wrap it. So you don't need a big 4-day window of drying. So that's one of the chief advantages in the eastern U.S., because you capture the quality that's in the field and you can cut it at the right stage. This year in Kentucky, and really last year as well, we've only had one window of good drying and baling weather. We had about a 8-day window a couple of weeks ago, and we didn't have before, and we haven't had it since. But those producers that were making that wrapped hay or baleage, they were able to still cut it and get the quality. We've got a number of cash hay producers that they would rather make small bales and sell it to horse owners and things like that and make a good profit. But typically they have wrappers, so they can take the first cutting off at a good timing, get it wrapped, feed it to their own cows or sell it locally. So then they can have good timing of their subsequent cuttings. One key thing though, if you decide to go to the expense of either buying your own wrapper or borrowing one, obviously there's a cost to that, but there's a cost to plastic. Don't even bother doing it if you're thinking about scrimping on the amount of plastic. We found in studies over and over and over. In fact, Dr. Jimmy Henning here just did one last year. And the common denominator with those that made good baleage, meaning that it preserved well, was that they had 4 to 6 layers of plastic. And in more cases, the ones with 6 were the best. And Dr. Henning found that even the goal is to get it about 60% moisture, so it'll ensol well. He found that that the problems were created by 2 reasons. One, those that got it too wet, like they were baling it right after cutting, or some cereal solids that was really wet, 70 or 80% moisture, they got into all kind of issues, botulism, etc. But on the lower end of the moisture, some were baling it and wrapping it at 35, 40% moisture. And they got away with it because if you have sufficient layers of wrap, then even if it doesn't ferment well, it's going to prevent oxygen from going in there and causing mold to grow. So the best guarantee is to give plenty of layers of wrap, not just trying to scrimp it and just say it's covered. The only time that I would have put 1 or 2 layers is if it's completely dry hay and I put it on there just to shed water. But if you've got 30% moisture, 40% moisture, or any moisture really, and you just have 1 or 2 layers, you're going to end up with a mess, just a moldy mess that you're going to end up just filling up some ditches with. Or in the case of one producer last year, killing some cattle by having some pretty bad stuff growing in there.
Okay.
Ray, we never done this before, but I'm going to have a show and tell here. So I share my screen here. Ray gave me this slide years ago and I use it just about every balance talk. And I'm hoping you all see baleage.
Yes.
Yeah, you might also want to talk through it in case somebody's listening by phone too. Ben.
Well, okay, yeah. So what this picture is, you can see there's 4 hay rings set up, and it basically 1 has hay and 3 has baleage with different layers. And Ray, I'll let you kind of explain this, but these numbers they show is basically the utilization rate of that bale, right?
Mm-hmm. So those 4 bales sitting out there, and the cattle have equal access to all of those. And after, I think this was after a couple of days, but the important point is that after the cows have been out there, they had eaten 44% of the dry hay. They had eaten where we had baleage with just 2 layers of wrap, so it hadn't really preserved that well. They had eaten 53% of it. But when they had 4 layers or 6 layers, they were up into 80% with how much they had eaten. In essence, they had pretty well eaten it all in that 4 layers and 6 layers. And so, you know, I'm a big proponent of making baleage, because the fact that you can get the good quality, you can capture that by not having to get a big window for drying. You can have better quality for your animals, but you need to wrap it as soon as you can after baling, and you need to use sufficient layers of wrap.
What about bale maintenance? I know some of our guys have a problems that, you know, some of them do not have the correct equipment to grab those wrap bales and move them without puncturing them. They make patches and tape, right, for those bales?
Oh, exactly right. So there's a special tape. In fact, I like that tape just for general use around the house, because it's such a strong tape and it's so durable. So you could just say, well, I get a hole, I'll patch it with duct tape, but duct tape is not UV stabilized. It's not going to last as long. And if you have a hole in that that wrap bale or that wrap line of bales, then oxygen comes in and you get rotting happening in a zone. You know, it can be a pretty big zone around that hole. In fact, one of the cases where some cattle were lost last year, the farm in northern Kentucky, was one bale that had gotten a hole in it and had rotted. And when the cattle got to that particular bale, several of them were eating on it and lost a few of them. So, you know, I don't want to scare people and say, oh, I don't want to take any chances. But if you use multiple layers of wrap, you know, you keep an eye on it. If it gets to be a rip or tear, you just tape it up. No problem. Just, you know, looking out there. In the middle of the winter, everything's frozen. It doesn't matter so much. But when the weather's a little bit warmer, you keep an eye out there every few days and just tape it. You know, maybe you get a raccoon on there that starts digging around. You just tape up those patches and send your kid out there with your 22 to take care of the raccoon. So
Make sure that kid doesn't have a weed eater, because I've seen a lot of places where people try to weed eat close to those inline wraps, and they just end up just making a mess and going right across the bottom.
yeah, good point, Ben. I mean, since you've got it wrapped already, the weeds growing around, it's really not going to matter. So just take care of that after you've fed the bales.
We might have went past this point a little bit, but Ronnie, our ag unit director, put in the chat that Dr. Rayburn said that when you are making baleage, you could, he conducted a study a few years back that said you could eliminate the tedding steps. So that would save a lot of money for producers.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you found that with your
go ahead, sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Dr. Smith. Have you had any experience trying that in your haylage making, or having producers discuss that with you as well?
That's a really good point, because your goal typically when you're cutting hay, when it's green, it's about, in the spring it's about 80% moisture. A little later in the summer, it maybe drop down to 75. You're only talking about wilting it, you know, down to about 60. So usually an overnight wilt, unless it's really cloudy weather, you're going to get it down to that. And so there's no point in tedding it. You're just going to lay it down there and spread it out and then rake it right before you bale it. So it really is a simple process, but you have that extra effort to get a wrapper and to pay for the plastic, but you have a guaranteed quality coming out the other end, is the real benefit. And a lot of people You know, I don't know if I know of hardly anybody that wraps everything. If they can get it all the way to dry hay with good quality, they got a good window of drying, they'll go ahead and do that. If they can't, a lot of times it's hard to in the first cutting, they'll go ahead and do baleage. And then they've got some of both, some really high quality feed, some average quality feed.
Well, tedding kind of moved us in the direction that we're kind of, I guess, thinking about going next. You know, we kind of wrapped up there with the wrap bales, and no puns intended. But then, you know, you're in that stage with that dry hay. You've got it cut, you got it on the ground. You know, talking about curing, I know you need probably around 4 good days. A lot of people are going to go out there and ted it, and you know, they're going to beat it to death. What, you know, talking about that curing, you know, and I know it depends on ground moisture and you know, the length of time you have, but when should you ted and when should you not ted?
Well, let me mention one thing even before tedding is when
Okay.
you're cutting, if you can put that swath just as wide as possible, so you've got a maximum exposure to sunlight, then that's going to help the drying a whole lot. I mean, it's a little more convenient not to have it as wide, but it's not going to dry as much. The narrow swaths really only make sense in the Western U.S. where it's irrigated and it never rains, that they can leave it out there longer. So wide swath to start with. Then the tedding is going to, you know, fluff that up. Some tedders kind of turn it over, and so it's going to get faster drying. You get into the summertime and you got good drying conditions and it's not real thick, then often tedding is not even needed. If no point in tedding if you're getting good drying, because as you said, you've got the risk with tedding of knocking leaves off, especially if you've got a legume. And the folks that are growing alfalfa grass in Kentucky, many of them are tedding, but they're tedding often the day after cutting, when there's still dew on it to kind of fluff it up to get it to dry a little bit faster. Now you may say, well, I'm not growing alfalfa, but if you're trying to keep your clover leaves in that hay you've got, when they get dry enough, you know, if they're a little bit crispy and the leaves get crispy pretty quick, the tedding knocks all the leaves off. So you've lost your protein, a lot of the quality. So ideally, the tedding should happen when the hay is 40% moisture or better, not when it's just about ready to bale.
Okay. Okay. And a question I was going to ask Ashley before I got to the tedding, I did skip one. You know, when you are cutting that hay to lay it down, either if it's for baleage or dry hay or whatever, you know, how much are you leaving out there? I mean, how much stubble do you think is the right amount of stubble to leave?
Oh, really, really good question, John David. So the rule of thumb that I use and that I talk to producers about is leaving 3 to 4 inches of stubble. And the best example I've got of the impact that can have is we did some research with a summer student a few years ago. Ben probably remembers this, where we cut at, well, first of all, this mower, you can cut really low. You know, you got the ability to do that. It can handle cutting low. So we cut as close as we could to the ground, you know, less than an inch. And then in some other plots, we cut at 2 inches. And then in other plots, we cut at 4 inches. This was in a straight orchard grass stand. And we went into a perfect hay stand of orchard grass. I mean, it was solid as could be. The end of that season, that one season of cutting at those different heights, where we were cutting it down less than 1 inch, it was a 20% stand. And that 1 year, we had ruined that stand. Where we were cutting at 2 inches, leaving 2 inches of stubble, the stand was about 50% of what it was normally. Now, it was able to recover by the following year, but we had a lot of weed growth happening from how that stand had thinned out. Where we had left 4 inches of stubble, that stand was 90 to 100%. I mean, in essence, it was solid. Now, people will say, well, if I leave 4 inches, then I'm leaving good product there in the field rather than in my bales. And they're true. On our very first cutting, that year we were doing that study, we did have more bale weight at half an inch than we did at 4 inches. But as the season progressed, we were wiping out the sand and it wasn't regrowing as quickly. So very quickly, the 4 inch stubble actually produced more. You had a healthier stand. You'd have less issues with weeds, so you could be saving on herbicides, saving on just having weedy hay. Now, tall fescue, it's a little lower growing or lower crown than the orchard grass, so you could say 3 inches would be sufficient. But I've talked to a number of producers, even with tall fescue, and they'll talk about, I'm cutting with my disc mower, I'm cutting low, but I keep having weed issues. And when I can convince them to raise the height, often what they come back is they'll talk about how they're having less weed issues, they have better regrowth. So it just makes a huge difference. And many of the older disc mowers, they're not easy to change the height. But I think pretty well all the manufacturers have kits that you can do. That the typical kit is kind of it's almost like a Frisbee, a metal plate that you put up, or metal disc like you put up under each of the discs. It just holds it up off the ground. The newer disc mowers and disc binds, they typically have better height adjustment.
Okay.
Right. And, I mean, just to he reiterate what you said earlier too, that you're gaining a little bit more quantity, but you're not getting much quality from cutting the extra bottom 4
That's
inches.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Quality.
No, really good point, Ben. So you're losing quality. You're reducing the life of the stand. Another really big thing, I keep having people say, I'm having more problems with foxtail and crabgrass coming up in my fields. You do a cutting in June or later in the summer, and you cut it down really close, then you open up bare ground, even a pretty good stand. And if you have this much bare ground, that's enough sunlight and heating up of the soil to germinate the crabgrass or foxtail or other seed that are there. If you can keep a little taller height and shading, then those warm season annual grasses, they need this, not only the heat, but the sunlight to be able to germinate. And so you cutting closer is easier, but you're creating a lot of problems.
I wish I had this picture. I could show you another one, but I got caught out last year in foxtail issue, and it could draw a line through this field just where just half of it was pure fescue, half of it was just foxtail, yellow foxtail, and it was just basically they cut one half and not cut the other half and scalped it.
Yeah.
But if you're having issues, around here with not being able to keep Timothy and orchard grass, it all comes down to cutting height, from my experience. Most of
definitely those two, like that example I gave, you're going to wipe a stand out. Fescue you can get by, but it still doesn't grow back as quickly, and you still start getting into weed issues and stuff like that.
Yeah, my husband and I, we had the experience with foxtail. We'd never seen that in our fields before, but we cut during a really dry time, and it was low, so we talked to Dr. Rayburn about that and learned a little bit about cutting heights and how important it is to make sure that's off the ground in the dry months of summer.
Yeah, you can, there's a new herbicide registered for hay fields and pastures called Prowl H2O. That's a pre-emergent herbicide. So if you're having foxtail issues, after that first cutting, the ground's opened up, you could use the Prowl H2O. See a jug right there. But a simpler way is to not cut so tight. If you're leaving it taller and you're still having foxtail, then you might need to go to the Prowl H2O. But if you're not one that really wants to spend extra money that you don't have to, then leaving that stubble to shade can make a huge difference.
Every person I would who have actually changed, they've done so begrudgingly, finally tried it, and then next year they were just amazed. But just how quicker it grows, and like Ray said, lack of weed issues. So
now, I always like to play devil's advocate a little bit, just to stimulate the conversation. Definitely, I'm a big supporter of leaving that stubble. But if you have a situation like where you're trying to establish some clovers, you've done a little bit of frost seeding, that first cutting, would you, just after that frost seeding, not every year, not every time, would you cut a little bit lower to stimulate that legume growth, get that canopy fall?
Yeah, good point. If you've got another reason to cut lower, like you say, you're cutting closer so the clover can grow. You're actually, in that case, you're trying to set back the grass to help the clover. So that makes sense. Most cases, we don't want to set back the grass. Same thing goes if you're going to do some overseeding into a field. That cutting that you're taking in late August, early September, cut it really close so that you open up the ground for your overseeding. You get there late in the summer, you get into September, then typically you're not going to have things like foxtail coming up when you get that late in the year. So yeah, there's some useful purposes in cutting low or in grazing low. Just like when we talk about frost seeding, we talk about grazing low, so that seed hits the bare soil and gets worked into the ground. So John David, good point with that.
And what other varieties? We have a lot of tall fescue in West Virginia. We have a little bit of orchard grass out there. We usually have some white clovers, maybe a little red clovers come on early there. What other mixes or grasses would you recommend? Kind of, you were talking about overseeding maybe into that pasture. Would you recommend to go into that hay mix?
Well, let me mention a couple of things. First of all, there's a lot of recent research, a lot of it happening that colleagues at Ben knows, the USDA ARS station there in Lexington. And they found a whole lot of benefits of red clover besides just a good quality forage. They found benefits in animals that are suffering from fescue toxicosis, of dilating the blood vessels just from some compounds within that red clover. They found more efficient feed consumption because of that red clover, this one compound called biocanin A, knocking out some of the wasteful type bacteria. So, but outside of those new benefits, red clover grows up taller. It fits well as a hay crop. So into hay fields, typically, if someone it's just a hay field, it's not a pasture too, I'll say just do your frost seeding with red clover. You get more growth. It's a little easier to dry red clover than white clover. Now, if it's going to be hay and pasture, then typically we'll recommend a mixture of red clover and white clover. Or when I say white, I'm talking about the bigger ladino type. Now, I talk about grasses in typical hay fields. We all know across the whole transition zone how well fescue does. There's a number of newer varieties of fescue that have the benefits of Kentucky 31, but don't have the problems. We typically call those novel endophyte tall fescues or beneficial endophyte tall fescues. The first one that came out was Jessup. There's several newer ones like Lacefield and Bar Optima and other ones. Seed cost is a little bit more, but you've got an endophyte in the plant that's helping the plant survive. That's just like Kentucky 31. But Kentucky 31, the endophyte's also producing toxic alkaloids, ergot alkaloids that are causing animal issues. Even in hay, if you're feeding Kentucky 31 hay in the winter, particularly that has stems and seed heads, then you're having issues with those animals not doing well and having vasoconstriction. So using the novel endophyte tall fescues, it's worth that little extra cost in seed. So for the typical beef cattle producer, I encourage them to think about a grass that's really well adapted to the area, to West Virginia. That's where fescue fits. Orchard grass does really well as too. And if you're selling cash hay, then a lot of people want to buy orchard grass. But to me, fescue is probably, in my mind, the first choice in using an improved variety.
I 100% agree. I 100% agree. And we've done a lot of studies. On hay plots and pastures, with the, Texoma, other improved Bar Optima and whatnot. And we've also seen, what is your thought on the different leaves? Because, some of the older improved varieties had the same leaves set as the Kentucky 31. Some of the newer ones had a softer leaf, a different type of leaf. What is your, preference, I guess? Have you seen any difference in cattle performance on that?
Well, definitely on the softer leaf types, and the two of the newer tall fescues, one is Bar Optima plus E34, and the other is Tower Protect. They're both softer leafed varieties. There's some other ones that are endophyte free that are softer leaf. we definitely see that the animals prefer it, particularly at that first grazing. When we plant strips in the field, they'll go to those softer leaf strips. So there's a benefit. I mean, the disadvantage of the softer leaf types is the animals will graze those into the ground. So you got to pay more attention to your grazing management. The tower is one that tends not to have as long a term survival. Our Optima has held up quite well. So I generally tell people if you're looking at, if you're doing grass-fed beef, if you're doing something where that top quality and that top quality palatability makes sense, the softer leaf probably makes sense to you. If you're talking about just a good general fescue, then I think what I call the Kentucky 31 types that have a little bigger leaf, they're going to make good hay. They're going to grow well in the summer. They're going to stockpile well because a little coarser leaf is better for stockpiling than any of those other improved varieties make sense. If that kind of answers your question, John David.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
Then you have,
I've been surprisingly get a lot more interest in from producers around here in smooth burn grass and teff grass. I was wondering if you can kind of go over some of the pros and cons for each of those.
Yeah, good question. And if I was talking, well, not that we'd be doing a podcast 40 years ago, but if I was talking 40 or 50 years ago, West Virginia, there've been a lot of smooth burn grass planted, and it kind of fell out of favor because the grass doesn't. It's kind of hard to establish. When I was up in Canada, in Manitoba, that was the main grass. A little harder to establish, and it produces, a super first cutting. It keeps its maturity better when it has a seed head, but it just doesn't grow back real well. And so people said, well, I need to plant fescue or orchard grass. It gives them more cuttings. A lot of the recent interest in smooth burn grass is, well, I love having one big cutting and getting my hay in. And the fact that it holds its quality a little bit better. If I do get into a rainy period, I can wait a little bit later, cut that smooth burn grass, get that high yield, good palatability. Maybe I'm not so worried about the cuttings I get later. Also, smooth burn grass is more drought tolerant. More growth, and you get into some dry periods. You just got to remember that it's harder to establish. The seedlings are less vigorous. The seed is bigger. You've got to make sure it doesn't clog up your seed tubes. Not a lot of improvements in varieties of smooth burn grass, but most of the ones on the market are pretty well adapted in West Virginia. Now teff is a different issue because it's a summer annual grass. For those of you not familiar, teff is actually widely grown in Eastern Africa, like Ethiopia, for the grain. Now it's a tiny little seed, but get enough of those seed, you can grind it and make bread out of it. But the advantages of forage is it makes quite fine leaves. It's better than a lot of the other summer annual grasses like the Sudan grass or sorghum Sudan or pearl millet because it has that fine leaf. So you got to plant it every year, and you get usually 3 cuttings during that year. So it really fits well as a summer annual. Now there's a couple of major limitations though to teff. The seed is so tiny and it's not very competitive that I've not seen good stands hardly ever that someone just tried to put into an existing field. You really want to go into a tilled field and seed it with a cul-de-pac type seeder, a brilliant type seeder, or if you are going to broadcast it, or if you're going to use a drill, then I take the tubes out of the double disc and drop it on top of the ground and then cul-de-pac over the top. So it's got to be really shallow. Other thing is it's such a fine stem and leaf, which is a good thing. But if you're not really careful with your nitrogen, it'll grow up too tall and it'll lodge over. So with teff, unlike the sorghum Sudan, you're talking about giving it, 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen there at planting, and after the first or second cutting, going with another 40 pounds. Whereas sorghum Sudan grass, you might give 60, 80 pounds at seeding and another 60 after each cutting. Where producers that are growing teff in Kentucky are typically when they're transitioning from one hay stand or one pasture stand to another, because maybe they've got a hay stand that's really rough, it's really weedy. So they spray that out, they till it up, they get the field good and even, seed teff in. They've got a high value hay crop that summer. Then they've got a nice even seed bed that they can go and drill straight into with their cool season perennials. So teff fits well there. Smooth grown fits well as a good one cut, high quality hay crop and good drought tolerance. Yeah, good questions being on that.
When we're looking at whatever type of hay we go with, or whatever, plant variety, or what we prefer, we're talking about nutrients and cutting into the right stage to try to cure it and get it into that bale and into the barn as quickly as possible, to maintain those nutrients. And really, a lot of people do not know what their hay nutrients are. They've cut the hay, they rent land, they just cut it free to clean it up or whatever. There's so many different ways people, the reasons people do what they do. I'm a big, I guess, pusher of a hay test. We do the soil test, we push soil tests. What about hay test? What should we be looking at when we're thinking about performing a hay test, and when we get those analysis back?
Yeah, good question, John David. First thing is I encourage everyone to take a hay test, and ideally take that on every lot of hay. Meaning, a lot of hay would be you cut a field, and then that one cutting, you take a hay test from that bale. A cutting of that same field, later in the summer, you take another hay test, because it can vary a whole lot. And when I'm talking about hay quality testing, I've got some Rubbermaid bins that I carry around with different hay samples. And I ask people to just look at it and tell me what the quality is. And about the only one that they consistently get it right and say, this is really good quality, is the really leafy alfalfa, or alfalfa orchard grass. That's the best quality. But most cow producers aren't growing or feeding alfalfa orchard grass. When we get into the other grasses, they often, they'll get it wrong. It's hard to tell just by looking at something. But with a hay quality test, you have exactly what's there. Kind of the same way with soil testing. You could just put triple 19 on every year and hope for the best. You're probably getting things out of balance, and you're probably over fertilizing some nutrients and not others. Same thing with hay quality. If you're just kind of given a supplement because you just always have done it, or because your dad did it, then you might well be feeding a hay that doesn't need a supplement, and you're wasting money. On the other hand, I think it was 3 winters ago, a lot of producers were just feeding hay like they had normally, and we had cattle that actually starved to death in Kentucky for 2 reasons. One, we had a bad hay production season, meaning that people were really late in cutting because of rain, and it was a particularly cold, wet winter, and the cattle needed the quality to keep that body weight. And so in those cases, if producers had taken the effort to make a hay test, they would have realized, well, I've got to supplement, or I've got to feed some better quality hay with my lower quality hay to keep the condition of those animals. It's a little bit of trouble, but I'm sure you guys as county agents and other county agents in the state are glad to help you out, loan you a probe. The probe is just a hollow tube that you're drilling into the bale, so you get a good sample. It's pretty simple to send it off. There's a range of prices from the different labs. Typically it ranges anywhere from $15 to $25 a sample. But you think about it. 1 bag of concentrate feed is going to pay for the hay test. And you can find out whether you need it or whether you don't need it.
Definitely. And our Western Conservation District, the district that I'm in, they offer 4 free tests every year. Wow. 2 being hay samples, grab samples, and then 2 being hay samples. So therefore you have the 4 availability, forage samples, but only 2 of those are hay. So I really, I go around, I always keep a soil probe handy, or a hay probe and a soil probe handy. And, we go in and I go out to farms all the time, especially, usually around the second cutting, and I start sampling hay. I buy all my hay, so it's very important that I know who has the best hay in the county, right? So I help these guys out. But of course I do it for all producers. But that way I can tell them, you need to feed this hay, starting out the winter. This hay is where you need to be in lactation, last third trimester, whatever, because that's going to be important to spread those nutrients out, to meet those cattle's nutrient requirements at whatever stage they're in. So I think me, Ben, and Brandy, we've all, we've beat the hillsides around our counties helping these producers. And I really urge you, if you are interested, no matter what county you're in West Virginia here, get a hold of your local county agent, get with us, and we will come out and look at that hay. And hay's a good thing because it's in the barn. So it doesn't matter if it's tomorrow or 2 weeks, we can get out there and get you a good core sample. So
right. And most of us have that tool that goes, like you showed just a sample of, thanks to some grant funding. We have it right here in our office. I would highly encourage, the forage sampler that drills into the round bales, square bales, whatnot. If a producer is really serious about testing their forages on a regular basis, invest in one of those. If not, invest in one. Call the extension office, because most likely we're going to have it and it's available for use. Or if we can come out and help you, we'd be more than glad to. And the conservation districts having that program where they will help supplement some of the costs. It's a no-brainer. Like soil testing used to take a while to get people around to soil testing, and it still does in some cases. But the fact that we have these tools available, I don't know if you have over in Jackson County or Putnam County, Ben, we even have a moisture tester for like the windrows that we can go out and help people who are trying to learn how to make baleage for the first time, just get a feel for what their moisture is in their fields as well before baling.
And John Davis of the Western District, most of the conservation districts in the state offer free testing. I will say, if you get testing, make sure you need to get a NAFTA, National Forage Testing Alliance.
That's right.
And that way, because what that is, there's basically, it's an organization that goes through and does quality assurance to make sure that these labs are accurate and precise. And just because I don't want John Davis to start talking, I won't be able to get this out. But people concerned about paying for that. There's been work done at WVU that it's a 10-to-1 return. For every $1 you pay go into hay testing, you get about $10 back in return. So it's a really good management tool to make decisions, and it's very economical. I know most time about $25 for a good test seems kind of off-putting, but it is very valuable tool.
That's what I was going to say, Ben. We really need to give people an idea. It's not that much, $17 to $25 samples. It's worth it to know you're getting the right nutrients to your livestock.
And if you can go with that 30-hour test, that usually, I think that's what Dr. Rayburn pushes, because that gives the good representation of how long it spends in the rumen. But if you go with some of the conservation districts, you kind of have to just go with what they offer. I mean, unless they do a cost share. Some of the districts will do that if they will pay, they have a set lab and just say $25 is their test that they do. And if your test goes to $28, they will pay $25 and you pay the remaining portion. So check with your districts there to see which tests they offer and to see if they would be willing to go in on that and do a cost share and give you that much money to go for another test. Some will, some will not.
The 30-hour test John Davis talked about is the NDF digestibility test. They do it for 30 hours, and it's more correlated with better TDN values. Ray, I guess we're getting close on time here, but I want to ask you one question. Maybe play devil's advocate a little bit. So the whole hay process, going from cutting all the way to feeding that bale, where, in your opinion, is most of the quality lost?
I'd say two places, Ben. Probably the biggest is people waiting too long to cut, letting it get too mature. Then the second most loss would be when they're in that process of baling, not paying attention to typically it's too dry, or it's in the middle of the afternoon and things are just crispy, and they're knocking a bunch of leaves off, and you can see it. A baler going through a field, and you see a big dust storm out there. And if it hasn't been dry for a month, then the dust storm is probably the leaves that are flying up into the air. So, watching that cut in the right stage and watching it baling. Now, Ben, in a lot of cases, though, let me add that a lot of quality is lost by hay that's left out in the field and stored under the trees or stored in a lower area. I mean, with our modern balers that bale tight, and particularly with net wrap, they shed water pretty well, but you need to store them where there's good drainage. You need to store them where water's not going to collect underneath. And it's easy. I mean, that's something you can control, but you got to make a little effort. Putting them inside is even better. But if you don't have inside storage, you can still do it well by how you place those bales.
That's where I was hoping you'd head with that, right? Because you knew everything right in the field, and you can lose a lot of quality just from poor storage and even poor feeding strategies. But yeah, mainly storage. So
yeah.
And if y'all are interested in hearing about how much of that is lost, you can go back and watch last week's segment. We talked about an hour and a half, I think, with some boys over in Tennessee. They done a good job, and they hashed it out very well. So, but if you want more information, I would encourage you to go back and listen to last week's segment with Larry and Cecil. They were two very interesting guys, and they done a good job. Any other questions before we are kind of getting right there at time? Any questions, Ben, Brandy, Ronnie? Anybody have? Okay. Well, thank you very much for everyone that tuned in and listened, and for the Mountaineer Farm Talk here, and the voice of West Virginia agriculture. And we will see you next time around the ridge.
Very good. Thanks so much. Good to talk with you, everybody, today.
thanks, Ray.